before my surgery, my daughter called to ask if I could take the grandkids for 4 days. Not to ask how I was feeling, not to check if I needed anything. To ask if I could take the grandkids. I had told her about the procedure 3 weeks earlier. I'd sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and I'd explained it as clearly as I could, that my cardiologist had found an irregular rhythm, that it had been happening for months, that we'd tried medication and it hadn't worked, and that the next step was a cardiac ablation. I told her the date. I told her I was nervous. I told her I would need someone to drive me to St. Michael's and bring me home afterward, that I couldn't drive myself, that the doctor had been very clear about that. She had nodded and said, "Okay, Mom, we'll figure it out." That was the last time either of them mentioned it. So when she called 3 weeks later and asked if I could take the kids, her 2 boys, 4 and 6, for the whole week while she and her husband went to a work conference in Vancouver, I thought for a moment that she'd simply forgotten, that it had slipped her mind. People get busy. I know that. I've always known that. I said, as gently as I could, "Sweetheart, that's the same week as my procedure. I'll be in the hospital Monday, and the doctor said I need to rest for several days after. I won't be able to manage the boys." There was a pause. Then she said, "It's not that serious, Mom. You'll probably be home by Tuesday." I didn't say anything for a moment. I was sitting in my kitchen in Oakville looking out at the backyard, at the bird feeder her father had built 22 years ago that I'd repainted 3 times because I couldn't bring myself to replace it. I was looking at that bird feeder and thinking about how to say what I needed to say without starting a fight. "The recovery isn't just 1 day," I said. "I won't be able to lift anything or run after them. I'm sorry. I really am." She said she'd have to think about what they were going to do. And then she hung up. She didn't ask who was driving me. She didn't ask what time the procedure was. She didn't say she hoped it went okay. She just said she had to figure out childcare and got off the phone. I sat there for a long time after that. I want you to understand something about the years before this, because I think it matters for what came after. When my daughter was 26, she and her husband bought their first house, a semi-detached in Mississauga. A little run-down but with good bones, her husband said. They didn't have enough for the down payment. They were short by $40,000. I had some savings. Not a lot, not what I'd planned to retire on, but enough that I could help. I did it without hesitation. I transferred the money on a Thursday and they were able to close on the Friday. My daughter cried. She said she'd never forget it. That was 11 years ago. The money was never brought up again. Not repaid. Not mentioned. I don't say that to be bitter. I made the choice freely and I would make it the same way again. But I want you to understand the shape of things. When my grandson was born, the first one, I drove 45 minutes each way 3 times a week for the first year. They lived in Brampton then. I'd get there by 8 in the morning so my daughter could sleep, and I'd stay until 4, sometimes later. I did that for 12 months. I changed diapers and sang songs and walked the baby around the kitchen in circles because that was the only thing that calmed him down. I did it because I loved them. I never asked for anything. When they decided to renovate the kitchen 2 years ago, my son-in-law's back went out and my daughter was working full-time. So I came over on weekends for 2 months and helped manage the contractors, painted the trim myself, watched the kids so they could go to Home Depot without hauling 2 small boys do the lumber section. I was 64. My knees were already giving me trouble by then. I want to be very honest with you about something. I didn't do any of it expecting payment or gratitude or some future reward. I did it because that's what family does, or at least that's what I believed. But I also want to be honest about this. I was tired. By the time that phone call happened, I had been tired for a long time. The call that changed things didn't come from my daughter, it came from my son-in-law. 2 days after she and I had spoken, he texted me. Not called, texted. It said, "We've had a chance to talk it over and we really need you to help us out here. The conference has been booked for months. There aren't other options. We're sure you'll be feeling up to it by Tuesday." I read it 3 times. I had a cardiac ablation scheduled. The kind where they thread catheters through your blood vessels and ablate the tissue, causing the irregular rhythm. My cardiologist, a careful, soft-spoken man named Dr. Osei, had told me that I would need to lie relatively flat for at least 6 hours afterward, that I should not drive for 48 hours, that I should not exert myself physically for a week, that there was a small but real risk of complications, including bleeding and, in rare cases, stroke. He had given me a pamphlet. He had looked me in the eyes and said, "You need someone with you, Gloria, not optional." And my son-in-law, who knew all of this, had texted to say they were sure I'd be feeling up to it by Tuesday. I put the phone face down on the counter and went and stood on the back porch for a while. It was October, cold, the way Ontario gets in early fall, damp and gray, and the leaves coming down fast. I stood there in my cardigan and I thought about what it means to be a mother, what it means to have done everything right, or tried to, and to end up here. Standing on a porch in the cold, wondering if you've somehow made yourself invisible to the people you love most. I didn't text back that day. My daughter called the following evening. I could tell from her voice that she'd spent some time rehearsing what she wanted to say. She started by telling me she understood I was nervous about the procedure. That word, nervous, like I was afraid of the dentist, but that they had really counted on this and it wasn't fair to change plans at the last minute, that her husband's company had paid for the flights and the hotel and the conference registration, and that there would be professional consequences if they didn't go, that they'd called everyone they could think of and no one else was available, that the boys loved being with me and would probably be a good distraction. A good distraction. I let her finish. I waited until I was sure she was done. Then I said, "I have a cardiac procedure scheduled for Monday morning at St. Michael's Hospital. Dr. O.C. has told me I cannot care for children in the days following. I am not able to do this." Silence. "Mom." "Not yet." "I'm not able to do this," I said again, quietly, but I didn't move from it. She told me I was being dramatic, that her friend had had something similar done and was back to normal within 2 days, that the boys weren't that much work, that the older one was practically self-sufficient, that she really needed me to think about what this meant for them. I noticed something in that moment, something I hadn't quite let myself see before. She hadn't asked once. Not in that conversation, not in any conversation since I'd told her how I was feeling about it, not whether I was scared, not whether I had someone to take me, not whether I needed anything, not one question about me. I said, "I love you. And I'm sorry I can't help you this time. I have to go." And I hung up. She called back within the hour. I didn't answer. She called the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. She said she needed me to reconsider, that she hoped I would think about what this was doing to the family, that the boys would be confused and upset. Nothing about my health. Nothing at all. I drove to my sister's that afternoon, my younger sister Winifred, who lives in Burlington and who has always been the steadier one of the two of us. I sat at her table and I told her everything. Winifred is not the kind of person who says a lot. She brought me tea and she sat across from me and she listened, and when I was finished she said, "You're not the one who created this problem, Gloria." That's all she said. But it was enough. I had told myself the same thing a dozen times, but hearing it from someone else, someone who knew me, who had known our family for 60 years, something in my chest loosened just slightly. I slept at Winifred's that night, the first full night's sleep I'd had in a week. My daughter and her husband left for Vancouver on the Sunday. I know this because I drove past the house on my way to the pharmacy that afternoon. Not on purpose, my pharmacy is in that direction, and their car was gone. There were no lights on. I don't know what they did about the children. I didn't ask, and they didn't tell me. Monday morning, I drove myself to St. Michael's at 6 a.m. You're not supposed to drive yourself, I know that, but there are only so many times you can ask for help and have it land in empty space before you stop asking. Winifred had offered, but Burlington is 40 minutes away and I didn't want to ask her to get up at 5 in the morning, so I drove. I told myself I'd call a cab home. The waiting room was quiet and very cold. I sat in a chair by the window with my coat folded on my lap, and I watched the sky get lighter, and I thought about a lot of things. About my mother, who had died alone in a hospital in Sudbury when I was 31, and who I hadn't been able to reach in time. About my husband, who'd been gone 8 years now, who would have driven me there and sat in that waiting room reading a Tom Clancy novel and complained about the parking. About the $40,000 and all the Tuesdays in Brampton and the weekends painting trim. About whether love is still love when it only flows one way. A nurse came out and called my name. She was young, maybe 30, with her hair in a bun and a kind way about her. And when she saw me sitting there alone, she said, "Is there someone coming to be with you today?" I told her no. She patted my hand. She said, "That's all right. We'll take good care of you." And that small thing made me cry for the first time in weeks, standing there in a hospital gown with paper slippers on my feet, crying because a stranger had been kind to me, because it had been so long since anyone had asked if someone was coming. The procedure went well, Dr. Rassi told me after. I was groggy and cold, and my chest felt like someone had pressed hard on it from the inside, but the rhythm was corrected and there were no complications. I lay flat for several hours in recovery, staring at the ceiling tiles and listening to the beeping of the monitors and thinking that this was not how I'd imagined this day. The taxi ride home took 40 minutes. The driver was a man named, he told me when I got in, Kwame. And he talked to me the whole way about his daughter's hockey tournament in Barrie and how she'd scored twice in the final game. I listened and I asked questions, and by the time we pulled up to my house, I was genuinely glad for the company. I got inside and lay down on the couch with a blanket, and I did not move for most of the afternoon. My phone had 2 messages, one from Winifred, checking in, one from my neighbor, 2 doors down, a woman named Harriet, 71, who gardened obsessively and left zucchini on people's porches every August, asking if I needed anything brought over. Nothing from my daughter. I texted Winifred back and told her I was home and okay. I texted Harriet and said I'd love some of the soup she'd mentioned once making. She appeared at my door 40 minutes later with a full pot of chicken vegetable and a loaf of sourdough, and she stayed for an hour and we talked about nothing important, and it was one of the nicest hours I'd had in months. My daughter called on the Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after the procedure, 2 days after they must have landed back in Toronto. Her voice was different, quieter. She asked how I was feeling. It was the first time she had asked. I told her I was recovering well, that the procedure had gone as planned, that I was tired but okay. She said she was glad. There was a pause, and then she said, "I know things have been difficult between us." I didn't say anything. I was stressed, and I know that doesn't. She stopped, started again. "I should have asked how you were. When you first told me, I should have asked." I had waited years, I think, without knowing it, to hear something like that. Some small crack in the certainty that I was simply a resource to be drawn on. But the strange thing was that when I heard it, I didn't feel relief. I felt very tired, and I felt something else, something that had been growing quietly in me for much longer than this, that had just needed this particular week to come fully into focus. I said, "I appreciate that. I'm glad you said it." And then I said, "I need some time, sweetheart, just some time to myself." She said she understood. I don't know if she did. It was Harriet who told me about the community group, older women in town, some widowed, some just living alone by choice, who got together on Thursday evenings in the church hall on Lakeshore. She'd been going for 3 years and had never mentioned it. She said it wasn't really something you advertised. People found it when they needed it. I went the Thursday after my procedure, still moving carefully, still tired in a bone-deep way. There were 11 women in folding chairs in a circle, a table with a coffee urn and some sad-looking shortbreads, a woman named Roberta leading things who had the kind of directness I've always appreciated in people. Roberta asked everyone to introduce themselves and say one thing that had been hard lately. When it came to me, I said, "I'm Gloria. I had a heart procedure last week and I went through it alone, and I think I'm only beginning to understand why that happened. The room was quiet. Then the woman across from me, gray-haired, maybe 75, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, said, "That's the beginning of something right there." I didn't know what she meant exactly, but I thought about it all the way home. I've been to that group 6 times now. I've learned that Roberta raised 3 kids on her own after her husband left and put herself through accounting school at night. That the woman with the reading glasses, her name is Adele, hiked the Camino de Santiago at 73 and is planning to do it again. That most of the women in that room have a version of my story. Some piece of it. Some particular way they were made to feel that their needs came last or didn't register at all. We don't sit around complaining. Mostly we talk about what we want the next part to look like. That's a question I'd stopped asking myself somewhere along the way. What I wanted, not what was needed, not who needed me, but what I actually wanted. It turns out I have answers. I want to go to Portugal. I've wanted to go since I was 40, and something always came up. I want to learn to play the piano, which I tried briefly in my 50s and abandoned. I want to spend Sunday mornings reading without feeling like I should be doing something useful instead. I want to stop apologizing for having a body that needs things, including rest, including recovery time after a cardiac procedure. I want to stop buying love with my inconvenience. My daughter and I talk on the phone now, once a week or so. It's different from before, more careful, more honest in small ways, though we haven't had the real conversation yet. Maybe we will. Maybe it will take longer than I expect. She's not a bad person. I've never thought that. She got used to a version of me that was always available, always accommodating, and she built her life around that version. Part of this is on me for never drawing a line until everything broke. The boys visited last month. Just for the afternoon, a Sunday, and it was their parents' idea, which I noticed. The older one helped me fill the bird feeder. The younger one fell asleep on my couch with his shoes still on. I sat in the armchair across from him, and I watched him sleep the way small children sleep, completely, with nothing held back. And I felt something soften in me that I hadn't even realized was clenched. I don't know how the rest of this shapes up. I don't know if my daughter and I find our way to something new or just manage what we have. I don't know if she understands what happened, what really happened. But I know that I'm different now in some way that I can't fully explain. Like a room that's been rearranged and is still the same room, but you move through it differently. The week before my surgery, my daughter called to ask if I could take the grandkids. And I said no. For the first time in 37 years of motherhood, I said no, and I said no, and I went through the hardest week I've had since losing my husband, and I came out the other side. Harriet left a pot of soup on my porch last week. I didn't need it this time, but I kept it anyway. Some things you just want to hold on to. I've thought a lot about that taxi ride home from St. Michael's. Kwame talking about his daughter's hockey tournament. Me sitting in the back seat with my coat across my lap, chest sore, eyes tired, listening to a stranger describe a moment of pure parental pride. I was happy for him. I genuinely was. And I noticed that I was also, for the first time in a very long time, simply present, not needed anywhere, not overdue for anything, just a woman in a cab going home after something hard. That's when it became clear to me what I'd lost somewhere along the way. Not love, exactly, but the basic understanding that I was a person, with limits, with needs, with a body that occasionally required a cardiac ablation and a week of rest afterward. Somewhere in 37 years of saying yes, I had made myself so available that I stopped being real to the people who relied on me. I had become a function, and functions don't get sick. Functions don't get sick with them in waiting rooms. What I understand now is that this didn't happen because my daughter is cruel. She's not. She's someone who was handed a version of me that never said no, and she built her expectations accordingly. That's partly on me. Probably more than partly. The choices we make over years. To smooth things over, to absorb the inconvenience, to let things go because the peace isn't worth the fight. Those choices add up to something. They become the shape of the relationship. And eventually, you're standing in a hospital gown wondering why no one came. The right thing to do, I think, is to be honest about what happened without spending the rest of my life in bitterness about it. That takes something. It takes knowing the difference between understanding why someone behaved the way they did and accepting that it's okay they did it. Those are not the same thing. I had to get clear on that before I could move forward with any kind of honesty toward my daughter, toward Winifred, toward myself. It also takes a certain kind of quiet courage that I didn't know I had until I needed it. Saying no to my daughter that week was not dramatic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't issue ultimatums. I just said the thing that was true and I stayed with it even when she pushed back, even when she called it dramatic, even when the silence afterward was so heavy I could feel it in my ribs. That's the hardest version of strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that just holds steady while the other person decides what to do with it. And what I learned from Adele, from Roberta, from Harriet showing up with soup she didn't have to bring, is that clarity about your own worth tends to draw the right people closer. Not always the ones you expected. Sometimes the kindness comes from a neighbor with zucchini and a good pot of chicken vegetable. Sometimes it comes from a woman across a circle of folding chairs who says simply that what you just said is the beginning of something. You don't always get to choose where the warmth comes from. But when you stop abandoning yourself to keep everyone else comfortable, you start to notice it. I'm still figuring out what this next part looks like, but for the first time in a long time, I'm the one doing the figuring.